Most of us, if we are honest, live inside a continual storm of our own making. Not the storm of events, but the storm of our commentary upon them. We talk to ourselves. We talk back to others in our heads. We rehearse replies we will never send. We drown every quiet moment in explanation, justification, outrage, planning. And all the while a voice, the only voice that really matters, is speaking. Not in thunder, not in earthquake, not even in wind, but in the silence we refuse to enter. Tonight I want to ask you a single uncomfortable question. What if the reason you cannot hear God is not because he has gone silent, but because you have never truly stopped making noise? Most of us, if we are honest, live inside a continual storm of our own making. Not the storm of events, but the storm of our commentary upon them. We talk to ourselves. We talk back to others in our heads. We rehearse replies we will never send. We drown every quiet moment in explanation, justification, outrage, planning. And all the while a voice, the only voice that really matters, is speaking. Not in thunder, not in earthquake, not even in wind, but in the silence we refuse to enter. Tonight I want to ask you a single uncomfortable question. What if the reason you cannot hear God is not because he has gone silent, but because you have never truly stopped making noise? Consider for a moment what has become of the inside of your own head. The modern soul has turned itself into a house of perpetual echo. Every waking hour is crowded with sound that we ourselves supply. There is the inner voice that replays yesterday's conversation, editing it now to make us sound cleverer, kinder, or more wronged than we actually were. There is the voice that leaps ahead to tomorrow, scripting confrontations that may never happen, defenses we will never need to deliver. There is the low, constant murmur of self-justification, the endless argument with people who are not even present. Add to this the newer habit of carrying in our pockets a machine that delivers fresh outrage, fresh opinion, fresh distraction every few seconds, and we have created a din so continuous that we scarcely notice it any longer. We have mistaken this racket for thinking. We have mistaken it for living. Silence, in such a world, is no longer regarded as rest. It has become something almost indecent, an awkward pause that must be filled at once, lest we be thought idle, or dull, or worst of all afraid. We reach for the radio, the screen, the conversation, the mental rehearsal, anything to avoid the terrible nakedness of a mind left alone with itself. Yet the old wisdom, the wisdom that has guided souls far more perceptive than ours, tells us something quite different. It tells us that the first condition of hearing God is the deliberate refusal to fill the emptiness ourselves. Think how strange this is. We say we long to know his will. We say we desire his voice. Yet the moment a fragment of quiet appears 5 minutes in the car, a walk without earphones, the space between one task and the next, we rush to crowd it with something of our own making. We are like children who beg their father to speak to them, then cover their ears and shout their own questions the instant he draws near. The tragedy is not that God has withdrawn. The tragedy is that we have made the room so noisy, he must wait outside the door until we are willing to let the clamor die down. This is not a matter of temperament. The noisy soul is not merely the extrovert, it is the soul, any soul, that has never learned to sit still in its own company. And until we learn that stillness, until we stop treating silence as an enemy to be conquered rather than a space to be entered, we shall go on mistaking the echo of our own thoughts for the whisper of heaven. So the question returns quietly, insistently, are you willing to let the house fall silent long enough to find out who has been speaking in it all along? Let us now turn to the second matter, which follows quite naturally from the first. Having seen how relentlessly we fill our inner rooms with noise of our own invention, we must face a harder truth. God seldom shouts over our noise. He waits behind it. Picture, if you will, a father who has come home after a long day longing to speak quietly with his child. The child, however, is in the midst of a furious game shouting commands to imaginary armies, banging toys together, running from room to room in a state of joyous pandemonium. The father stands at the doorway and calls once, softly. No answer. He calls again, a little louder. Still nothing. The child is not being disobedient. He is simply too absorbed in his own clamor to notice that anyone else is present. The father does not then seize a trumpet and blast a fanfare through the house. He does not storm in and demand attention by force. He waits. He stands in the doorway, patient, silent, until the game winds down and the small head finally turns and sees him there. So it is with us and God. We imagine that if only he would speak more forcefully, if only he would thunder from the heavens, or send some unmistakable sign, or interrupt our lives with dramatic intervention, then we would hear him. We complain that he is distant, that he is silent, that he has abandoned us to our confusion. But consider, he is not competing for the stage. The stage is already occupied by our own voice, our own commentary, our own keyless inner broadcasting. He does not shout over it because he need not. He is not weak. He is refined. The still small voice that came to Elijah after wind and earthquake and fire was not a lesser voice. It was a voice so pure, so free of strain, that it required a quieted ear to perceive it at all. We have reversed the order of things. We suppose that divine speech must resemble human speech at its most urgent, loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. Yet the opposite is true. The more authoritative the speaker, the less he needs to raise his voice. A king does not bellow across the court to make himself heard. He speaks quietly, knowing that those who wish to hear will lean in. So God speaks quietly, knowing that those who truly wish to hear will first stop filling the air with their own sound. This is why the old spiritual writers insisted that the beginning of real communion is not fervent speech on our part, but deliberate stillness. Not because God is shy or uncertain, far from it, but because he will not force his way past the clamor we ourselves have raised. He waits behind it, not out of inability, but out of respect for the freedom he has given us. He will not shout down our noise, he will let our noise exhaust itself. And when at last it does, when the inner storm begins to subside, when the rehearsed arguments and imagined retorts and endless self-justifications run out of breath, then, and only then, do we discover that he has been speaking all along, in the very register we had been too busy to notice. The tragedy then is not divine silence. The tragedy is our refusal to let the din die long enough to discover that the room was never empty. God is not absent. He is simply waiting for us to stop drowning him out. And so I ask you plainly, how long will you keep shouting into the storm you have made? Before you turn, quiet your voice and listen for the one who has been standing there, patient, all this time. We have spoken of the storm we carry inside us, and of the way God waits patiently behind it, rather than forcing his way through our clamor. Now let us look a little closer at what we actually do when we come to speak with him what we call prayer. Most of what passes for prayer in our days is, if we are truthful, a disguised monologue. We enter the presence of God much as a barrister enters a courtroom, armed with arguments, prepared with evidence, eager to set the record straight. We bring him long lists of requests, as though he were a forgetful clerk who needs reminding. We recount our troubles in exhaustive detail, as though he had not been present when they began. We explain our motives, justify our failures, rehearse the reasons why our circumstances are so very difficult to understand, and sometimes, we must admit it, we even offer him a little advice on how he might more efficiently arrange the world to suit our present needs. All this we pour out with fervor, and then we rise from our knees satisfied that we have prayed. But have we? Real conversation requires two speakers. Yet in this supposed dialogue, only one voice is heard, ours. We speak at God rather than to him, and having spoken, we depart before waiting to discover whether he has anything to say in return. It is rather like ringing up a friend, delivering a 10-minute speech about one's troubles, then hanging up the moment one has finished without giving the other party time to draw breath. We should think such behavior rude in human intercourse, yet we practice it daily before the face of God and call it communion. The moment of true prayer, the moment when prayer becomes something more than religious performance, begins precisely when we stop, when the stream of words runs dry, when the clever interpretations and emotional justifications and anxious petitions finally falter, when we are left with nothing to say and no desire to say it. In that sudden naked silence we become present, not as petitioners with a prepared case, but as creatures simply there, exposed, without script or defense. And it is then, and only then, that the other voice can be heard. We do not reach that moment easily. The soul resists it with every instinct it possesses. The mind leaps at once to fill the gap with another thought, another worry, another pious phrase, anything to avoid the vulnerability of wordlessness. We are terrified of what we might discover if we let the monologue cease. Perhaps that our motives are less pure than we supposed. Perhaps that our grievances are less just. Perhaps that the answers we so urgently demand have already been given, and we have simply refused to listen. So we keep talking, keep explaining, keep performing, because silence feels like surrender, and surrender feels like defeat. Yet it is no defeat. It is the beginning of real meeting. When we at last lay down the pretense of being the only speaker in the room, we make space for the one who has been listening all along, and he does not speak to fill a vacancy with noise. He speaks to fill a vacancy with himself. So I put it to you very simply. How much longer will you go on addressing God as though he were deaf, rather than listening to him as though he were near? We have considered the storm we ourselves create, the patience with which God waits behind it, and the way our so-called prayers so often turn into uninterrupted speeches delivered to an audience we never quite allow to speak. Let us now look at what happens when, at last, we stop. Silence is not emptiness. It is the space God fills when we stop crowding him out. Imagine a room so packed with furniture that no one can move through it. Chairs piled upon tables, books stacked to the ceiling, every corner jammed with objects collected over years, some useful once, many never used at all. The air itself feels thick, pressed down by the sheer weight of possession. Now suppose someone enters with the intention of living in that room, of breathing freely, of seeing the light that comes through the windows. What must happen first? Not more furniture, not clever rearrangement. Removal. One piece carried out, then another, until the floor begins to appear again, until the walls can be seen, until the light falls where it was meant to fall, and the air begins to move. Only then does the room become habitable, not because it has been filled with something new, but because it has been cleared of what was never meant to stay. So it is with the soul. We have furnished our inner lives with layer upon layer of mental clutter. The grudge nursed for a decade, the fear replayed like a worn-out record, the plan we are determined to force upon the future. The image of ourselves we are forever polishing, the commentary we run on every event as though the world required our constant narration. All this we keep, convinced that if we set any of it down, we shall lose something essential. Yet the moment we begin reluctantly, fearfully to let these things go, something unexpected occurs. The space does not remain vacant. It is filled, not with noise, not with another voice of our own making, but with a presence that was there before we began to crowd it out. This is why the old writers spoke of silence, not as a barren thing, a mere absence, but as a positive condition. It is the removal of barriers. When the clamor of self-justification dies away, when the anxious planning ceases, when we stop explaining ourselves even to ourselves, the soul becomes like a room swept clean. And into that clean, quiet space comes the one who has been standing at the door all along, not forcing entry, not shouting to be noticed, but waiting to be welcomed. He does not arrive with fanfare, he arrives with himself. And that arrival is enough. We fear such emptiness because we have been taught to dread any moment in which we are not in control, not producing, not performing. Yet the moment we allow the clutter to be carried away, we discover that what we dreaded was never emptiness at all. It was the prelude to meeting. The silence we fled is the very place where God is most free to be, God to us. Not as the answerer of our prepared questions, not as the endorser of our carefully edited life story, but as the one who knows us better than we know ourselves and loves us more wisely than we love anything. The room was never meant to be a warehouse. It was meant to be a dwelling place. And it becomes one the moment we stop insisting on furnishing it ourselves. So I ask you gently yet quite seriously, what piece of mental furniture are you still clutching tonight, afraid that if you set it down the room will be empty, when in truth the emptiness you fear is only the doorway through which he has been waiting to enter all along? We come now to the last of these reflections, and it is perhaps the most hopeful. For if we have seen how relentlessly we fill our souls with noise, how God waits patiently behind it, how our prayers so often remain one-sided speeches, and how silence is not a void, but a cleared space that he may enter, then we must ask what becomes of the man who, having learned these things, begins to practice them. The man who learns to be silent before God will one day speak with an authority he never manufactured. Observe the pattern in those who have most deeply changed the world, not by noise, but by hearing. Moses did not become the lawgiver of a nation while he was still a prince in Egypt, eloquent and self-assured. He became it after 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, listening to wind and sand, learning the discipline of a quieted soul until the burning bush was not a spectacle to be explained away, but a voice to be obeyed. Elijah, after all his public confrontations, fled in despair, collapsed under a broom tree, and begged to die. Yet it was not in the whirlwind of his former zeal, nor in the fire of his old passion, nor in the earthquake of his righteous indignation that God came nearest. It was after all these had passed, after the soul had been stripped and stilled, that the still small voice found him in the cave and sent him forth again, not louder, but surer. Our Lord himself, though he was never less than fully divine, followed the same rhythm. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he withdrew to a desolate place and prayed, not because he lacked power, but because he knew that power without constant listening becomes mere performance. When he spoke afterward, whether to crowds, to disciples, to storms, to demons, the words carried a weight that astonished those who heard them. They did not sound rehearsed or anxious or self-promoting. They sounded as though they had been drawn from a deep, undisturbed well. This is the strange economy of the kingdom. The louder a man strives to be heard, the thinner his voice becomes. He persuades for a moment, perhaps, with cleverness or volume or moral indignation, but the impression fades as quickly as it was made. The man, however, who has first learned to be weightless before God, to sit in silence until the clamour of self dies down, finds, when he rises, that his words have acquired a solidity they never possessed before. They are not his own invention. They are freighted with something greater. People do not merely hear them, they are arrested by them. They sense that the speaker has been somewhere they have not, has heard something they have not, and has returned carrying not opinions but tidings. This authority cannot be faked or hurried. It is not the product of technique or eloquence or even sincerity alone. It is the slow, hidden consequence of a soul that has learned to prefer the whisper to the shout, the secret place to the platform, the listening ear to the ready tongue. Such a man does not need to raise his voice to be heard. He has only to speak, and the room grows quiet of its own accord, not because he commands attention, but because something truer than himself is speaking through him. And so the paradox completes itself. The man who fears silence most is the one least likely to be heard in the end. The man who embraces it, who dares to let the inner storm subside and the clutter be removed, who waits until he has nothing of his own left to say, that man, when he opens his mouth at last, speaks with a voice that echoes far beyond his lifetime.